I hear awesome guy and I think go on. Why stop there? Thanks to everybody for coming out, and thank you, Teresa, for allowing me to chat with her about this really remarkable book. And just to start with, I was thinking about it, and I thought, you've been carrying this story around with you for a really, really long time. And I'm wondering, did you always know that it would take the shape that it did, or were you thinking of it in other literary terms? Was it always a memoir? Was it ever going to be a collection of short stories? And were you surprised at the shape that it took?
Well, it started off kind of being a patchwork. It was little bits of stories here and there. And so putting it all together in a book the way it turned out was kind of a surprise, because I didn't realize that you could kind of break your linear narrative and put stuff in the middle. So that's why I have those little, artifact chapters to break it up. But I didn't know you could do that. So thank you, Rosemary Graham, for showing me that you can take any form and tell the story. So
the narrative is so tight and so economical. And this is one of the, I don't have to worry about giving anything away because you guys know what happens.
The title is There Was a Fire.
There Was a Fire. I'm really curious to know, and we'll talk in a moment about what you physically left behind. But as a writer, from a writer's perspective, what did you leave on the cutting room floor? And how did you make this such a tight, compact, and dare I say perfect book?
Well, actually, because it is kind of a slim volume, it was more of an issue of what else can you tell? What more can you add? How can you complete this picture of what your life was like before? So I don't think I cut as much as I added to the original. So I kept thinking like one of the things I did, I kept looking through old photo albums to see, look for clues of things that I'd completely forgotten about, things that I'd had in the house that I didn't remember that. So it brought back a whole flood of new things to write about.
And that's exactly where I wanted to go with this, is that you've walked perfectly into my line of questioning, is that your memory is so strong that, when we're reading this, we're there in those moments where you're sort of putting this all together again. Your memory is really, really strong, so that it turns out you don't really ever leave anything behind. And all throughout the narrative, you are kind of, we're Jews, we can say this, beating yourself up about right, about the guilt of, right?
Yeah.
You say Jewish and then guilt comes right after.
Right. It's that word association.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Jewish, guilt. But you do sort of have this kind of chastising yourself about why did I take the thing and not the thing? But it turns out that really you did take what you needed to take, which was your family and your memories. Those were intact.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about that? And also, were you surprised by how strong your memory really was about this stuff?
Well, I have a late addition to this book. I just met with our older son, Miles, who read the book finally. And I said, so, your mom wrote a book, what do you think? So he said, here's a point, nobody else is going to care about this really, but when you went to pick me up at my friend's house that day, we actually went back to the house and I picked up a few things. And I said, like what? And he said, well, my moose hat and a journal and something else. And so I was telling my daughter about that, and so she says, so he didn't bring his cat blanket. So you were absolved from leaving. I've been beating myself up for 25 years, like I should have brought his blanket. It turned out he had every opportunity to get his own blanket, and he didn't. So there you go.
And you do go to a lot of trouble to sort of reconstruct the cat blanket.
Yeah, it's a whole chapter.
Is it too late to ground him?
Well, actually, the sweet thing is that he was in 5th grade. He's now 35 and a half, and that cat blanket is still prominently displayed in his house. That he and his son snuggle up under it to read a story. So it's, it's So it was worth all the service.
Yeah. I can give you a memory. I was playing tennis for St. Mary's College in 1991. We were having a weekend practice. And I remember what was happening in the environment. And from my perspective, for us on the tennis team, I was standing on the tennis court looking around and going, what's happening here? And there was almost a kind of a surreal quality to those moments. And I was really struck by then seeing it from your perspective around the same time as I was seeing it. And of course, you're seeing it much differently because you're much more involved in it. There's that moment where the ashes are sort of flowing through the air, and from a writer's perspective, it's almost a beautiful moment. It's almost dreamlike and beautiful, even though it's something horrendous and terrible is about to happen. It's a really interesting moment that I just wanted to sort of bring up to you, that it's so kind of gorgeous in a weird way.
You know, I heard from a lot of people who were far away, like in San Francisco or, you know, places quite far from the fire. And they talked about seeing bits of books and, you know, little pieces of things drifting down, and it does sound poetic in a way.
Yeah, it's a stunning moment. I mean, and it's surprising because you know that this is about to devastate and change your life.
Right.
And instead of, you could have gotten revenge on that moment, but instead you rendered it kind of beautifully, which...
Thank you.
My mom was a therapist. She might have said you made peace with it.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Took 25 years.
Yeah, yeah. I want to talk about the time, because that is a long time to be carrying this around, and you are one of the most peaceful people I know. Was there the anger that must have bubbled up and kind of was weaving in and out of your psyche? How did you handle that, especially with having young children and not wanting them to see any kind of crack in the armor because they need you to be the knights of what happens next?
Anytime I was alone in the car, I would cry and scream. So yeah, driving around near me could have been hazardous because I really let loose when I was by myself, because you're right. I mean, I had these kids. We had to be strong for the kids. And so there were only maybe one or two times where we just really lost it, but they might contradict me, but they can write their own book, right? But yeah, I mean, I knew a fair number of single people who had much harder time because they didn't feel the pressure of, oh, we have to find a house, we have to get beds, we have to provide food, we have to create a home for these kids. I mean, they were, you know, junior high, middle school, 5th grade, and kindergarten. And so they pretty much went where we took them. They didn't really have a say in it. Especially James, who was just like, your house burned down. Okay, you know, when's lunch? I mean, he just, you know, ask him now, he doesn't really remember very much about any of that time.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Do you find that your kids' memories are, like, for example, and you've heard me say this before, memory is such a strange, clumsy editor of our lives. So I've told you this before, that when I was younger, my sister and I were on our street, and a car came down the street, and we went to go pet our cat, and the car, runaway car with no brakes, crashed into a light post. And if the cat hadn't been there, we wouldn't have gone over to pet her, and we would have been killed. And I would mention to my sister, and she would say, we never had a cat, right? It never happened. I don't know what you're talking about. So I wonder if does it match up? Like when you hear these, when you talk about it with your children now versus then even, do you find that it's morphing and moving around in terms of what the details were and are?
Well, this recent example about we went back to the house, don't you remember? I didn't remember. In my memory, I had Caitlin and James and Ethel the bird in the car, and it was like, swoop by, pick him up, and let's go. And he said, no, we went back to the house so I could get my moose hat, you know, and whatever. And I didn't remember that. But I think for the most part, because I kept a journal, that you were asking me, how do I remember all this stuff? Well, certain moments are just seared in your memory, not to use a fire word, but they really don't change over time. You know, you're pretty much locked into here's what we did and when, and what time did we leave the house? What did we take with us? How did we arrange all that? And I can just walk through that and see that. So I don't think I'm really missing anything.
That is such an important moment that you guys actually went back for his stuff. It's amazing to think that that didn't somehow get impressed upon your psyche.
Yeah, I know. What can I say?
I know. It's just really interesting to me how that works. There is, you know, if you watch too much television and you watch too many movies, you tend to think that when someone gets ill, that you have plenty of time to have this long, protracted goodbye. But you really don't, because in life, people drop dead, accidents happen, terrible things happen. You had this instance where there are some people who lose their homes in a fire. What did you say, it's a minute and a half?
Oh, not even.
It's like decimate a house in
11 seconds.
Yeah.
A sack. 11 seconds. It's like a bomb drops on the house and just
Gone. So you had moments to kind of go, okay, I have this moment of time. I'm going to grab these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
The leather jacket.
The leather jacket.
The pictures, right?
Yeah.
Do you find yourself in your mind sometimes going back in and getting different things, regardless of forgetting the Miles' cat thing? But do you ever think about that?
Sure. I mean, I think about, well, let's see, I would have grabbed that box of letters. You know, I would have grabbed my jewelry box full of all the junky stuff I wore all the time, because what I took was the fancy things I hardly ever wore. And I didn't bring the nice box of stuff that had I had a cheeseburger and French fries pair of earrings. Cheeseburger. I love those earrings, and I didn't think to get those. But you know, when you look back on it, it makes you feel kind of like, oh, gee, I didn't bring that pair of shoes or that dress. You know, what could be that important to run back and get? But the one thing we both talk about this is the pictures that we had on the mantle, the pictures that we had on our bookshelves, the pictures that we looked at every day because we loved those pictures. We didn't take those pictures. We took the giant, albums of, big binders of pictures. We took all those, but not the ones that we liked so much we put out and looked at all the time. And most of those we couldn't really recreate. So, but having had 25 years to reflect on it, I think I'm not really devastated about what I left behind.
Right.
It's all in this book.
Right. Right.
So, a lot of it, anyway.
You got a great book out of it. This is a harder question, but what, in your estimation, it constitutes a home? It's not the stuff inside of it, right? Isn't the people? Because you do such a beautiful job in the book of juxtaposing the stuff inside the house versus the people in it as well.
Well, that is a key element to this whole thing, is how do you make the space you live in feel like your home? We've all moved into a new house. What do you do to make that feel like your home? And we really had to start, from the ground up. And so one of the things we did, my mom's group friends are in the front row here, they gave us a gift certificate to a bookstore. And so Bruce took the kids to the bookstore out in Orinda, Lafayette, and just got all the old favorite books, because we read to our kids from the very first day. We always had a story at bedtime, like most people do, but we didn't have those books. And so that was one way to start. Getting the music back was really important. The first time we were able to make our spaghetti sauce, everybody recognized the smell and the taste of that. So everything was new. Everything we had to get, like sheets and all that stuff was new. And so what we discovered was some of our old routines and our old rituals and stuff like that is what really made it feel like home. So the first time we had a napkin fight, that was kind of bringing us back. It was right before the holidays also, and so, we celebrate every holiday there is. So, Christmas is like, we had all these really crazy ornaments. I write about King Kong in there, and we didn't have any of that stuff. And so, we had to try to manufacture a holiday that felt like old times, which was hard, I think. But yeah, I think it's the smells, it's the tastes, it's the stuff you see every day, and just our family doing the things that we always did, try to be, normal. And that's kind of what got it started, I think.
Did a lot of the people who lost their homes come back to that area, or did a lot of people just sort of?
Well, on our block, believe it or not, we were the young family on the block. We were one of a few young families. Now we're the Alta-cockers on the block. But a lot of the older folks just didn't have the stomach for it, to rebuild and come back and start over. And so many of them left, and younger families moved in. So we decided right away we were going to stay. We just made that decision almost immediately that we were going to rebuild because we really liked where we lived. And so, was that your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
And in the reassembling of your life, how were you different? Like, what changed in you in that process? How were you finding yourself reacting? How did you find yourself? Because it's a violation. Like you get this horrendous loss, and then you're rebuilding. And as you're rebuilding, and as you're buying the books, and as you're making the spaghetti sauce again, who are you then? Versus, because the person who was making the sauce and reading the books before all that was probably much more secure in terms of the world is so random it couldn't possibly be random in my direction in this way. But it did happen. Mm-hmm. How did it change you in that regard?
Well, we just saw, for Peter Pan on her 70th birthday at Berkeley Rep, I don't know if anybody's seen that yet, but one of the questions they ask each other is, when did you first feel like an adult in your life? And I think it was a real turning point because suddenly we were responsible for everything. And so I wouldn't say I'd been coasting exactly, but things were kind of going along fairly simply, routine, no major crises, and then there was all this stuff suddenly we had to attend to, and we had to make decisions, and we had to work with our wonderful architect who's actually here. Where is he? Who I told him, don't give me a lot of choices, because there are certain days I can't make a decision at all. I mean, James and I went shopping one time when I was visiting him, and I spent half an hour looking at white socks. Which ones do I want? White socks, really.
Right.
But so I suddenly had to decide to make decisions and be not debate it forever. Just like make a decision and live with it. And that was kind of a switch, because I'm a debater, and I'll think about things for a long time, and some days I just can't make a decision. And so for me, this threw me into a whole different area of being decisive, taking control, managing things, and making sure the kids didn't get left behind, things like that. I had to really step it up.
Were you in touch afterwards with a lot of people who had been there? Did you were able to track them down and sort of see how they were holding up emotionally? Because it's such a wrenching process.
Well, yeah, I think we would meet up at certain places. The neighbors, people,
like a support group maybe, or people who, because you've been through this thing together.
Yeah. And I would run into people, and one of the first questions is, did you get burned out? And then you both have a story to tell you. And so one of the things I wanted to do in this book was tell other people's stories too, to the extent that they were told to me. But some people, marriages broke up, things happened. People left the area, moved on, and people reacted in a lot of different ways. So I wouldn't say I had any kind of support group. I guess there was a group that met briefly for a while, and there was a publication. One of my neighbors started the Phoenix, a newsletter for fire survivors, and so everybody was sort of connected through that for a while. It was real pre-internet. There would be a fire Facebook group, I'm sure.
Right.
So,
Fire Facebook
I know,
group.
really, it's terrible. But we didn't really have that. But the school was a great source of community, and the parents of the school. And I think our school lost maybe 50 families lost their home, and it's a small school. And so some of the parents organized, dinners and carpools and things like that. So we were in communication with a lot of people that were very supportive during that time, which really saved us, I think.
In the actual construction of the book, did you visualize it in terms of the narrative arc? Did you always visualize it starting where it did and ending where it did? It would just seem, it seems like the progression would obviously be a natural one, but you were mentioning how Rosemary had taught you those idea of sections. And,
right.
Can you talk about what that brought to the presentation of the memoir itself?
Well, I wanted to break up the narrative for the reader. I thought just, to talk about the fire for the whole book would have been just hard, and so I decided to experiment a little bit with this format. And then I got really excited about experimenting with the format. And so, actually, to tell the truth, some people that are here from my St. Mary's remember that the ending and the beginning started off the other way.
Okay,
the epilogue was the prologue, the prologue. So I flipped them a few times. But ultimately I decided to bookend the story of the fire and then have life in between, if that makes sense.
It does. What was the biggest challenge for you with this book? What was the hardest part for you?
I think, people say when you're writing a memoir, the safest thing is to wait till everybody dies. So you don't run into trouble with the people that read it and go, that's not how it happened. But I did have to, one of my advisors at St. Mary's told me, he was my advisor on my thesis, and he said, you step up to the edge of this mud puddle and then you kind of walk around it. And he said, you really need to go through that mud puddle. So there were some parts of it that were uncomfortable for me to write about, and had to do with, staying at my in-laws, because we were there, all 5 of us and our bird, for it seemed like a month. I think it was only a week, 4 days. He says, okay, well, and that was hard for me to write, because I really did, our in-laws really, I try to think about it now, if my, kids came home with a bird and had to live there, how would I feel? I would go to stay at the Claremont, I guess. But so they were very gracious, but we got on their nerves, and I completely understand that now. But the way they took it out on us was, my house, my schedule, and I just wasn't in that frame of mind right then. I had too much stuff to do. And so that was a little uncomfortable and awkward, and so that was hard for me to write, because I really did care for them, and I didn't want to, say anything that would be disrespectful to their memories, but they, they're not here, and I haven't heard anything from my in-laws. My sister, brother-in-law haven't said anything. So, I wasn't unkind, it was just real, that it was awkward and uncomfortable, and, we cried a lot, and, like that.
There's, having a friend, having friendships, having family relationships, sometimes they're in name only, and they're by default, like you show up at family events and you go, oh, that guy, right? Like,
right,
okay,
yeah.
Here we are, we're all here for the same reason. But there are moments where your friends or your family do extraordinary things for you, and you look at them and you kind of go like, okay, so you're 1,000 times more special than anyone on this planet.
Yeah.
Were there moments with your friendships and with your family where you were stunned by it with gratitude and by their grace, by their generosity, by their support?
Sure, some of them are sitting right in the front row here. One of the things that we took when we left was our binder full of recipes. We started cooking together in high school, which some of you may remember that are here. And we collected recipes over time, and my sister didn't know that we'd grabbed that binder when we left the house along with the photo albums, but she copied by hand all the recipes that we'd given her. We'd share recipes like, you do. And she'd copy them all down by hand and given them back to me, not knowing that I took my binder. But they're in my binder now, and since, she's gone, it's like, oh, there's her little handwriting with my black midnight chocolate cake, kind of thing. So that took a lot of time to do that, to transcribe all that. And but like I said, my friends my neighbor lost her home too, and And so these friends threw us a shower, kind of a house shower, and we got laundry baskets. Stuff, you need a laundry basket for, in a house all of a sudden. Who wants to buy that? Nobody, dish towels, the pedestrian things you don't want to go out and buy, but that you need, and so, yeah, I mean, my friend Carol was really instrumental in bringing us food and taking care of kids and stuff like that. So yeah, there were definitely people that stood out as real champions.
There's a really marvelous memoir written years ago by a guy who had been attacked by a shark.
Yes.
And I love sharks. And he talked about how he had extraordinary friendships, extraordinary support system. He was fine. But he was carrying around this attack without writing about it for about 30 years.
Oh.
When he wrote the memoir, he said that he was like altered because he was able to almost exercise that, right?
Mm.
So for you to kind of go, all right, there was a fire, now there is a book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
How do you feel now that you've done it? Does it pave the way now for more stuff for you? Like you feel like I'm free of this?
Yeah, totally. It's a weight lifted, really. And I worked for so long on this book, before it really became a book. And once I went to St. Mary's, then it really was like, you've written it now, you write it more. That it was almost impossible to imagine that it would be done, that I would be over that now. Okay, I wrote it, it's here. So now what's next? Everyone,
Yeah.
What's next? Don't ask me that.
Right. I'm working on it.
I'm not sure. Yeah. But no, it was definitely a feeling of great relief, I think, to feel as though I had completed what I'd started.
And you'd come full circle.
Yeah.
I want to talk to you about the cover because I remember when you first showed it to me, it was pretty stunning. It's a beautiful cover. Can you talk a bit about how that came to be?
Sure. So this book is published by She Writes Press, and She Writes Press has a design team and an editing team. I mean, it's all the things you need to have in line to get a book published, they do. And so they asked me to go to a bookstore and take notes on the covers that I liked, and then tell them what I liked about those covers. And then they would come back with an image. And so the designer took into account what I told her, came back with this cover with just a few variations of font and punctuation. Sometimes there was a period at the end. And I actually took it into Great Good Place for Books, and I asked Kathleen and everybody who was in the store, I said, you guys look at books all day, which one of these do you like the best? And they picked this one, which was my first choice too. So it was just kind of a done deal. I mean, as soon as I saw that, I said, well, yeah, it's perfect, because you can kind of see letters in between the scorch marks there. And then it's scorch marks on the back. So, yeah.
Is it, when you read from it, you've done readings, you do readings, is it revisiting this material in a sort of, in a public way where you're reading it? Do you find that you get emotional? Because I imagine I would.
Yeah, when we had to do a reading at St. Mary's, and as part of the program, you read in front of your classmates, and I did read the epilogue, and I had stumbled a little bit, and that was the first time. And now I think I practice, and I get comfortable with it, and I'm breathing, so I haven't really had a moment like that since, but it could happen. It could still happen.
There's, we talk about trauma, and we talk about the idea that if you are, trauma we always think of as kind of like something major happens, but trauma could be something that even it seems kind of small. This is a rather massive one. Do you still find that it comes back to you? Just, moments where you're sort of blithely, maybe driving through the Caldecott Tunnel, or and you do live where it was. Do you find that it does kind of get summoned by the smell in the air, by the seasons by the sad Halloween that you write about, right?
Yeah, sad Halloween.
And then it was the saddest Halloween ever, yeah.
Sad.
Yeah. Do you find that it comes back to you and that you sort of, it sort of can strike you when you're not expecting it?
I am the first person to smell smoke, I think, anywhere. I'm really tuned into it. If I smell smoke, I'm looking around. But driving through the tunnel, I still remember when we lived out in Moraga, and no knock on Moraga, but coming through the tunnel and just seeing the bridge and the hills and the bay, every time it would just hurt my heart to not be permanent there at the time. We lived in Moraga for about a year, just over a year. So every day I would drive through that tunnel and see that view, and I grew up looking at that view.
Yeah.
I'm a native Californian, East Bay, and I've been looking at Mount Tam my entire life. So when I come through the tunnel and see that, it was the one joyous moment in my day. But now there's still construction. I mean, there is new construction in our neighborhood. There have been lots that were empty for almost 25 years.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
In your opinion, what is the responsibility? This is more of a process question. Do you think the responsibility of a memoirist is? Because we're all memoirists, we just don't all write it down, right? Like we're always,
Right.
We've lived a life and we think about that life sometimes on a daily basis, whether it's a relationship with a parent or an event or whatever it might be, we all have a story. And then there's a select few of us that actually write it down and we become a memoirist. In your estimation, what do you think the responsibility is of the memoirist? And I'd like to know also who you liked in that genre as well, that you look to for support and artistic guidance.
Trick question. I think I read somewhere that the goal of the memoirist should be to find the common heart of the readers. So even though you may not have lost your home in a fire, there are things in this book that relate to anybody who has a family and a home. And so the idea is that if you can create enough emotion and a scene, the details, like what is it they say, that the more personal the details, the more general. I'm not messing that up, but you know what I mean? It's more universal than you think. I read Abigail Thomas, a lot of Abigail Thomas, and I read, I meant to make a note of the people that I read, and I'm going to blank out on stuff.
Oh, okay.
No fair. Oh, Danny Shapiro. People that have riveting stories to tell, that do it in really beautiful language, and also mess with format.
Right. What did you admire about their voices and the way that they wrote?
Well, it's like, who are you writing to? Who's your audience? And if you're sitting down and you're talking to a friend, how do you tell your story like you're talking to a friend? And so that's what they do. You just read it and you think, oh, I know this person. So that was the kind of voice I was hoping I could use to not be all writerly and stuff, but just, tell the story as I lived it.
I guess my final question is, a lot of times and I'm sure everyone in this room is guilty of this, you look around your house and you go, I don't really need that thing, but I have it because I have falsely attached emotions to it, right? This is the root of hoarders, right?
Yeah.
Where you sort of attach emotions to objects, and it's really sort of a trick. That's a trick because there are no emotions in objects, right? But we tend to do it, and that kind of, it's almost like a form of animism. What is your relationship to? This is the least sophisticated question. What is your relationship to things? In other words, do you look at things the same way, or do you think because the way I look at it is, you get out of your house with your kids and your husband and your bird, and you guys were safe, and that's all that matters, right? Mm-hmm. Even the pictures don't matter. It's great that you have them, and it's fun to look at them, I'm sure, but they really don't matter, right? What matters is your family is safe, and what you remember in your heart can't be touched by a fire. So I'm curious to know, how do you feel? What is your relationship to stuff now, and is that different than it used to be?
Yeah, I'm the person that wants to get rid of stuff. I'm the person that's ready to do a purge almost any time.
But you didn't used to be.
No.
Oh.
Actually, ironically, I think I can use that word correctly. The summer before the fire, Bruce gave me a book on how to declutter your home.
Yeah.
This was long before Marie Kondo's, by the way. And so I don't know why he gave me that book, but he's the one. So I went through the house, and I went to every kid's room, and we played Keep or Dump, which is one of our family games, you know. And so if it doesn't fit you anymore, you don't play with it anymore, you're tired of it, out. So I went through the entire house. I got rid of a whole bunch of stuff. And so when I was called upon after the fire to do an inventory, which our insurance company asked us to do, I had a pretty good handle on everything that we had. You know, how many cookie sheets did I have? You know, how many pairs of socks, white socks. And so it was a reminder of really how little you actually need to have.
Right.
And so I had done a lot of whittling down before the fire. And so I remember when we were building the house, they told us, you've got all this room. We had, what do you call it, backfill under the house, or you've got all this storage. And I had to say, you know, we don't have anything. There's nothing to store. And so we realized we had all this house with nothing in it. And so that's why we built the tap studio. We have a tap studio. But I prefer to have, I like to be lean and mean. I don't really want to have a lot of stuff. And I've noticed, this is one of the things that my older two kids have said, is that they feel the same way about stuff.
That's interesting.
Yeah, they don't really want to have a lot of things. And I have to wonder if it's not because of the experience of losing just about everything at a young age.
So all of them have that same idea that they don't like a lot of stuff.
Well, the older two do. Like I said, James, you know, doesn't remember anything. So, I mean, he doesn't accumulate. No, I think maybe all three of them are like that now. They just don't want to have a lot of stuff.
If you play that game with most people, not that you should invite yourself into their house, but I'm just saying that if you were to play that game, keep or dump,
Yeah.
you would find that there's about, I would say, over 70% of the stuff is not even necessary or even used very often, right?
Yeah.
I always play a game where I say, if I haven't touched this in a year, it's going,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that people value the wrong things then? In other words, you've gone through this traumatic experience and it really taught you the value, what has value. And do you think that people overvalue things that really don't have value?
I can't judge. You know, I mean, my experience was, don't laugh at me, Sarah, I do judge, okay. She knows I do. But I'm up here, and so I'm lying. I haven't seen that too much in the people that I'm really closest to.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's really hard for people, if this belonged to someone was a favorite relative, and it carries more significance than it to the ordinary, person looking at it. It's like, well, this is bull. Yeah, but this bull, things like that. So people do put a value on those kinds of things. It's just a question of how many of those things do you really have to have. And I do like the idea, back to Marie Kondo's, of, honoring the memory that's attached to it and then letting it go. I don't have any trouble with that at all. I mean, there is one thing, the red jacket that my red jacket that I wore, I bought to wear to my dad's funeral, and got into a little dispute with my mom about not wearing it and not wearing it. It's still hanging in my closet. It's 15 years old now, and the shoulders are like out to here. And I'll probably never wear it again, but every time I look at it, I go, no, can't get rid of that.
Yeah.
So.
It's become a symbol.
Guilty, yeah. And that leather jacket, man, that's taken a lot of abuse.
Yeah.
But I still wear it occasionally. Still like it.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Yes.
So there are 3 times in my life that will always get people talking. One is, where were you when JFK died? And and one is, where were you when you heard about 9/11? And the third one is, what's your story of the Oakland fire? And Lisa, you did a wonderful job of finding your voice and evoking that in the reader of, I want to tell my story now.
Mm.
And I hear you saying that was what you were seeking to do, or you were very successful.
Yeah.
And I bet if we went around the room, we'd be here all night, because, especially for those of you who've read the book already, you want to tell your story. You know, if you were in New York and you read about it in the paper, you have a story about it. So well done.
Thanks, Kathy. My next door neighbor, Kathy. You know, I was just recently invited to speak at the Oakland Rotary number 3. And the man that was sitting up next to me at the table, we started talking about the fire, and he said, you know, there was a guy who had a great wine collection. And in order to save his wine collection, he took the bottles and put them in his swimming pool. Okay, guy with wine collection and swimming pool, not my neighborhood. But he put all the bottles of wine in the swimming pool, and he came back later and they were all saved, but all the labels are off. And so he was drinking mystery wine for a long time. And so the guy was telling me that, and I go, that's in my book. And then he said, and there were 2 women up in the pool at Hiller Highlands who the fire really just blew over them, and they were dunking their heads in the water, holding their breath as the fire blew over. I go, that's in my book too. I spoke with one of those women because I think, you know, my experience was one thing, but other people's were vastly different. And so I wanted to include other people's stories as well.
It's such a great image too of that in the pool. Like
It's
that.
horrible.
Yeah, it is. Yes, in the back.
Oh, Kathleen, hi.
Did you rebuild the house similarly to what it was originally, or did you completely change it?
Well, the lot didn't get any bigger, so we had the size of the lot, but we did change the arrangement. So all the kids' bedrooms were down at the end of the hall, and we had our own little section. And I think we went back a little further into the backyard. We really improved our position because the house had been, it was a homemade house, and the corners weren't exactly, you know, you could roll a marble from one corner to the other. It wasn't really built all that well. And so what we got, and thanks to Gary, where are you, Gary? Thank you, Gary. It's my architect. He put some of the elements that belong in a Rock Ridge house. So it's got the eyebrows, it's got arches, it's got the textured the walls, and just, you know, picture molding and just really nice details that made it look like it had always been there, like it belonged there. And so it was a vastly improved interior design on that house, and I love it still. Wouldn't change anything. So.
Other questions? We had a very thorough conversation,
Yes,
apparently.
we did. You left them speechless. So, oh, you have a question?
Yeah, about this getting rid of things.
Yeah.
That doesn't apply to books and CDs, does it?
Yes, it does.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. It does.
You got to be ruthless.
You
Otherwise, you have stacks of stuff.
have stacks of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Do you feel differently about fires and your fear of fires? I know you said when you smell smoke, you worry, but I've always been amazed at the idea that people rebuilt exactly where they lived, having survived, having gone through that trauma.
Could you repeat the question?
Sorry, yeah, could you repeat?
Well, our attitude about fire,
And why you
and
rebuilt?
why we rebuilt where we
Yeah.
did. Well, we rebuilt where we did because we were right across the street from the kids' elementary school, and that's like precious. And we've been talking about, oh, wouldn't it be fun to build a house someday? Not, you know, imagining that we would do it under pressure, because we had to. But I think the problem today is, and somebody was saying the inspector just came around, the fire department comes around and inspects your property, whether you have defensible space or trees touching your roof line or anything like that. And when I drive around the Berkeley Hills and I see all that, I just think, you know, what are they thinking? How can you have it that way? You don't you remember? And that's part of the reason why, I would like people to know that, yeah, it could happen again. So, and we lost all those trees, and the trees were conducting, that was how it jumped from place to place in some ways with the wind and all that, but we won't have those trees again in our lifetime anyway. But yeah, I don't worry about it where we are now, but I worry about it in other places where people aren't paying attention to what's safe, really. So, yes, Laura.
You're such a great storyteller. I think for a lot of people it's really hard to tell a story, and the way you do it is so compelling. What is one best piece of advice you ever got about how to tell a story?
Oh, that's a good question.
That's a great question.
Could you repeat the question?
What's the best way to tell a story? Or the best advice I got about how to tell a story? I think the best advice is to imagine who you're telling it to, and then write for that person. And so, if it's conversational or there are asides, or you digress, there's a sidebar. That's kind of how I talk, so it comes kind of naturally. But also the advice was about not stepping around those mud puddles, facing the hard stuff, because that's where the emotion is. And for somebody like I don't always connect the dots. I want the reader to be able to connect the dots, and I was, no, you got to put the dot. You got to do it. You got to make it, flesh it out. Sometimes more is more.
You did a great job with the dialogue. I thought that was a really good way that you connected the dots.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks, Laura, fellow writer.
Yeah, in the back.
Marcia.
Knowing you as I do for over 50 years, you went to high school. I remember you as a writer in high school. And I'd like to hear you talk about your process as a writer, how you organize your writing self. Do you have discipline? Do you get support? Do you have a group?
Yeah.
How are you as a writer? How does that go?
Well, sometimes it's I wake up already a paragraph in. I write a lot in my head, and Bruce thinks I'm staring out the window, and well, maybe I am. But there's a lot of staring at a screen that happens, and then there's note taking. I'm not a disciplined writer, and then I write for 2 hours every day, or I have that kind of I don't do that. But there are times when I'm just on a tear, and so for me, it's almost like long bursts interspersed with dry spells and nothing coming. But when I get an idea of something I really want to write about, then everything else just stops. And I think that's very interesting that you remember that. That's really sweet. Thank you. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, and remember those amazing posters you made with the psychedelic letters?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, right, yeah, I could do that writing. That was fun. Yeah, I enjoyed it. We some of us here had the alternative student newspaper at our high school, and I did write a little bit for that, which ended up cut up into small pieces and thrown around like confetti. I'm still bitter.
I'm still in trouble for it.
Still in trouble. But I guess I always, somewhere in the back of my mind, fancied myself being a writer someday. So.
Yes, in the back.
I have two questions. You can answer either or both.
Okay.
Can you stand up? 'Cause it's just hard to hear. Can you stand up?
I have two questions.
Fall
You can
down.
answer either or both.
Okay.
So do you get paranoid now? Like, oh, I'm leaving the house, I'm going on vacation, did I turn off the stove? Did I unplug my hair dryer? Oh, it's a lightning storm, maybe it's gonna come through and fry my house. And so is there a level of paranoia, or does it all just roll off you? So that's one question. And then the other question is, do you see it as a movie? And if so, who would play you?
You have to answer them both. They're too.
They're too good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always the one that double checks and makes sure that the stove is turned off. You'll back me up on this one. Yeah, the burners are off, the iron's unplugged, things like that. I check. I'm not, paranoid about it, but I do check things. And also, who plays me in the movie?
I know, I was thinking about that.
Meryl Streep.
Yeah, Susan Sarandon.
Helen Mirren with an American accent, with the hair.
But this would have to be someone who's about to turn 40 as an actress, right?
Oh,
so we can't have someone play you.
No, that's
I'm
correct.
serious. I'm
Not
taking
as
this
I am
question.
now.
I'm like getting really serious
Yeah,
about
let's
this.
talk about that.
Yeah.
Who would be me at 40? I'm going to have to get back to you on that one, Brenda. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, a whole other conversation, but women in their 30s in Hollywood. Okay, we should be able to name them, and yet we can't. That's troubling. But I'm going to think of somebody. Yeah.
Are you, having gone through this, are you struck sometimes by the fact that people don't realize how randomness can catch any one of us at any time?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And we're just kind of unaware, or, I don't know.
Well, like I said in the book, or maybe I didn't say it in the book. Yeah, once you've been on the low end of statistics a couple of times, you're always looking over your shoulder. I mean, seriously. I never in a million years thought that something like that would happen to me. I'm sure everybody who lost their house would say the same thing. A big fire like that in Oakland, how could that even happen? We just didn't even consider it as a possibility. And when we saw it from afar, like we never imagined that we'd jump the two freeways and get to our house. And I've heard people say if the wind hadn't changed, it would have gone all the way to the bay. So,
Right.
No, I never would have. Yeah, random, totally, especially if you look at our block, because there was, the block where I used to live, it was one house was gone and everything else was there. And then in other areas, every house was gone except for one. So yeah, the randomness was pretty striking.
I was teaching tennis in Orinda. There was a woman who lost her house in the fire. And I'll ask you off mic if you knew her. But every time she'd pick up her kid, this is 10 years later, she would tell me, well, I don't know if you know this, but we lost our house in the fire. And I thought, yeah, only every time I see you, you tell me that. So I thought,
Yeah.
Either she has a terrific therapist who's telling her to keep talking about it, or she needed one. Right? But the way you process this kind of stuff, everyone's different, and everyone processes it totally differently, because there is a form of PTSD that has to be involved in that, where these kind of callbacks of, I smell smoke, or I see this thing. That's a form of PTSD, that's right?
Yeah, in fact, sort of related, but there was a Alta Bates, the old Alta Bates, they had a session for people who survived the fire who were having weird dreams about it.
Interesting.
So you got together and talked about your weird dreams. And these dreams, several of the people said they stopped the fire in their dream. They saved their neighborhood. They made themselves the hero and stopped it, which I thought was amazing.
Yeah.
You go back and make it different than the way it was. And also just seeing what the kids' reactions were. Like, they want to blame somebody because kids want to think that randomness isn't part of their world. They want to know somebody's in charge. And so when there's something like this happens where the parents couldn't help it, that was very unsettling for the kids. So they wanted to know who was to blame. Was it a bad guy? Who did it? There had to be somebody. And there was like, we don't know. We never did.
And we never did find out.
I mean, no.
Wow.
The way I understand it, we didn't. So, yeah, accepting that randomness was really hard for young kids. That was the biggest challenge, I think.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.